Hello friends, welcome to the series Issues in World History 1, 20th Century, and today we will talk about League of Nations and assessment. In the earlier lecture on the League of Nations, with regard to its origins, we talked about the various bodies associated with it. In the earlier lecture with regard to the kinds of interventions which were made by the League of Nations at different levels, we talked about the various kinds of conflicts which came to the League for its decision, and how League intervened in these kind of conflicts, whether it was the Corfu incident, whether it was Ireland incident. So, we find that League was able to make some kind of intervention which was successful in nature. We find that these kinds of interventions which were made by the League in these regions, whether Upper Silesia or Mosul boundary dispute, they were being accepted by the nations which were in a war with each other. They were in a conflict with each other, whether it was a dispute between Greece and Bulgaria. We also find that League was able to intervene, and apart from that we also see that League was also engaged in various kinds of humanitarian works and non-political works like health and humanitarian work. It was also being undertaken by the League, and how it was also propagating the national and international issues of all types in the framework of the publication of books and journals as well. And we also see that how it was also engaged in disarmament, and how, which was one of the important concerns of the League, and it was also able to in a way bring about a number of changes with regard to the contribution which was made by the League. And we find that how in some of the issues it could not in a way intervene in a successful manner, where it failed to mediate successfully in the dispute between the European powers and China in connection with the rights of foreigners in China. And we see that the German attack on Poland, Italian attack on Abyssinia, and Japanese invasion of Manchuria, they also showed League in a very poor light, where we find that League was not able to leave its mark. And one of the reasons could also be seen that League did not have any army of its own, and it could not take any effective step against any big power. And we find that League failed to take a decisive and fair stand on the question of disarmament as well. And when we find that how the Japanese attack on Manchuria in 1931 was an outcome of militant nationalism in Japan, and the expansionist policies in Asia of Japan, resentment against the peace settlement of 1919, and the inadequate native resources of Japan and economic depression of 1930, all of them created such kind of a situation that Japanese aggressive kind of a militarism could be seen. And how Japan attacked Manchuria, it represented a determined bid to annex the territory of the member of League by use of the armed force. And we find that in this, League could not do more than summoning extraordinary meeting of the assembly, and it called for the ceasefire and the passing resolution condemning the action of Japan. But it failed in a way to take any kind of a strong measure, and it reflected very badly in that particular manner, where League could not intervene in a successful way. Apart from that, apart from Manchuria, where we find that how Japanese aggression or militarism showed League in a very poor light, we find that the situation of Abyssinia in October 1935, where the system of collective security was tested again, and here it failed. We find that how Italy and Ethiopia, Abyssinia, were the members of the League, and how both had promised friendship for each other as well. And we find that at the instance of Italy, Ethiopia joined League in 1923. Ethiopia and Abyssinia, we find that Italy was a party to the Treaty of 1906, under which Britain and France, they had promised to maintain the independence of Ethiopia. So, in this way we find that how some kind of cordial relations between Italy and Abyssinia or Ethiopia, they existed before this kind of a conflict came to the situation. and they had also been in some kind of a treaty of constant peace with each other, where some kind of a perpetual friendship could also be seen between them. And this kind of a treaty of constant peace, perpetual friendship, conciliation and arbitration was there in 1928, and they were also in a way trying in a way to have some kind of a cordial relationship. But we also see that they also signed the optional clause of the statute of the Permanent Court of International Justice, thereby giving court compulsory jurisdiction as well. So, both Ethiopia as well as Italy, they had this kind of a situation where they were in constant interaction with each other, and they had also in a way signed the General Act for the Pacific Settlement of the International Disputes of 1929. And we also see that both were the signatories to the Pact of Paris of 1928 as well. But despite all this, we find that how Italy crushed Abyssinia and the League could not take any step to halt the aggressor, and how Italy completed its conquest in May 1936. So, it was in a way some kind of a sad reflection on the part of the League of Nations, where it could not seriously intervene in this particular matter. And whatever decisions which were taken by the League in the framework of imposing the economic sanctions, but they did not include a ban on the export of oil, coal and steel to Italy. And we also see that how the other powers during that time, the European powers, those who were strong like Britain and France, they did not want to antagonize Mussolini, who was the ruler of Italy, so that he can be kept as an ally against Germany. And we find that because of such kind of an attitude which was displayed by these countries, the smaller states, they lost faith in the League of Nations as well. We also see that apart from Manchuria and Abyssinia, there were the other instances as well, where we find that the German troops, they marched into Rhineland in March 1936 in the violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and no action was taken against Germany, although the safety of both in France and Belgium was in danger. So, we find that in 1936, when Germany demilitarized Rhineland during that time, and how it in a way violated the Treaty of Versailles, which was being signed by the Allied and the Axis powers, League could not make an active intervention. And we also see that apart from this, when civil war broke out in Spain in 1936, General Franco was backed by Hitler and Mussolini and was given all possible help. But Britain and France did nothing to help the Republican regime there, and how the Republican regime failed in Spain during this time. And when Hitler annexed Austria in 1938, no action was taken by League as well. So, such kind of actions which were happening at the international level, and how Britain and France, they were not supporting in the civil war which was happening in Spain to the Republican cause, and on the other hand nationalists, they were being supported by Hitler and Mussolini, both in terms of man and material, and a lot of help which was being given to them. And we find that how the strength of Hitler was also gaining some kind of a momentum in 1930s, where we find that the big powers like Britain and France, both of them, they also indulged in the appeasement policy, where they did not interfere when Germany was becoming more and more aggressive, which also resulted in the Second World War. And we also see that this kind of a situation, where some kind of a crisis in Czechoslovakia, and nobody came to the help of Czechoslovakia, and Germany was allowed to dismember her in 1938. And we also see that League in a way failed, it did not take any kind of an action, and how rest of Czechoslovakia was merged into Germany in March 1939. So, we find that within 6 months World War started, in which large number of nations of the world were involved at one stage or other, and the system of collective security failed as well. So, it was up to the League to understand and assess the situation in 1930s, and how Germany was gaining its strength, how Hitler was becoming more and more aggressive, and it should have taken some kind of steps by which we find that the actions of Hitler, they could be controlled in a way. But we find that the big powers like Britain and France, they also got engaged in the appeasement policy, where they did not want to antagonize Hitler and Mussolini to an extent that it could reach war. So, we find that this was also one of the reasons for this kind of a collective failure of these nations. And when you talk about that how League failed and what were the reasons of the failure of the League, we find that it failed to function from 1939, and it was formally dissolved in 1946 as well. So, it was because of the Second World War, its failure in the Second World War to contain the war, and finally we find that UNO, or the United Nations organization, came into operation. So, when you tend to understand League, we find that it was an organization of the victors, and how it was closely linked with the Treaty of Versailles and exclusion of Germany from this and other defeated countries. So, it in a way showed some kind of a political vendetta of the victors. Moreover, we find that League had to defend peace settlement, which was far from perfect. So, League was at some kind of a disadvantageous position from this point of view, because the Treaty of Versailles had everything for the victors, and even the guilt clause which was there in the Treaty of Versailles was with regard to Germany, where Germany had to accept that it was responsible for the war. So, it was we see that how League also had to defend the Treaty of Versailles, or the peace settlement which had taken place, and this peace settlement was seen as some kind of a dictated peace, where the provisions which were being enforced during this time, they were discriminatory in that sense that they were not in favor of Germany and other defeated nations, and they were also in a way to such an extent that Germany and other nations, they felt humiliated because of the treatment which was meted out to the members, those who had gone to sign the Treaty of Versailles. And secondly, we also see that the refusal of USA's Senate to join the League of Nations, it deprived it of a powerful nation who had a lot of influence in the international affairs, and the presence of USA would have definitely contributed financially and psychologically. So, one of the reasons with regard to the failure of the League is also being seen in the framework of absence of USA as a member of the League, and how when USA did not join the League, then we find that a powerful nation of the stature of USA was not part of the League. In that sense, we find that how USA would have in a way helped League financially and psychologically, which would have been to the advantage of the League, which has been seen as one of the reasons for the weakness of the League, and how it is also seen as one of the failures in that sense. And we find that when you talk about why USA did not join it, then we find that it in a way wanted to follow the policy of isolation, and it did not want to embroil itself in another war. And also when you see the politics of USA at that point of time, we find that the Republicans, who were now in a majority in Senate, and the opposition to Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat. And so, this kind of internal politics which was also happening in USA was not within that particular framework where USA would have joined the League of Nations. And we find that when USA was not part of the League, and how Germany and Russia in beginning, they were also not part of the League, the leadership mantle was assumed by France and Britain, who were torn between their concern for League's interest and their own. So, we find that the interests of Britain and France, they were seen to be paramount by themselves, and they were not largely concerned with the interests of the League, in the framework that when in 1930s Hitler was continually acquiring more and more areas in terms of expanding Germany, and both Britain and France, they were following policy of appeasement. They were thinking that at one stage Hitler is going to stop, but that did not happen. So, they made some kind of a miscalculation in this regard. They were not able to assess the situation, and League could not interfere directly in that sense, and League failed miserably as well. And we also see that how League nurtured the wartime prejudices even during the times of peace, and the powerful members of the League, they excluded Germany from the membership of the League. And though Germany was allowed to join the League in 1926, but the way it was insulted in the Paris peace settlement, as well as it was being excluded from the League of Nations, it prompted Hitler to declare League as a part of the Versailles Diktat. So, in this sense, we find that some kind of an attitude which could be seen during this time in terms of the prejudice, that how League of Nations intentions were to maintain the world peace, but at the same time we find that how Germany was being excluded from being part of the League initially, and even when it joined the League, the way, the kind of treatment which was meted out to her during the Treaty of Versailles was one of the reasons for the annoyance of Germany, and Germany was not able to or reconcile itself to the kind of situation it was in, and it wanted to seek revenge from the victorious powers of the First World War. And when Germany in a way withdrew from the League of Nations in 1939, it was also seen as some kind of a result of this kind of a belief. So, we find that if you see the initial years of the League of Nations, some of the big powers, especially the world's big three powers, they were absent from the League. Germany, USA and Russia, they were not part of the League in the initial part. And we also see that how Russia was kept out of the League on the premise that Russia had withdrawn from the war, and Russia was a communist country by that time. So, that was another kind of a prejudice which was carried on by the League, where it was not ready to treat every nation as equal when they were part of the League. And it was also seen during that time that how Russia was a betrayer, that it had in a way withdrawn from the war, and it was seen to be more dangerous than Germany. And Russia believed that the League wanted to destroy the first communist government on the earth, and her belief gained precedence when Russia was expelled enthusiastically in 1939. So, we find that the treatment which was being meted out to the big powers by the League of Nations was also not liked by these nations. Apart from that, we also see that there were weaknesses in the covenant of League which also contributed to its decline. And many times we find that the people, those who were deliberating on the various disputes of the League, they were not able to come at some kind of a unanimous decisions, and a number of attempts they were being made to strengthen the covenant, but these failed because there was no unanimity on this particular issue. And if the rules or the covenant which were there of the League, if they will not be sound, then definitely it would in a way will not be helpful to the cause of League. And we find that in 1924, British Labour Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald brought a resolution called as the Geneva Protocol, which pledged members to agree to arbitration and support any victim of unprovoked aggression. And we find that how the government which was there, which replaced the MacDonald, it conveyed to the League that they reject the protocol as they were not ready to commit Britain and dominions to the safeguard of all frontiers of 1919. So, this conservative government in a way changed that particular kind of a decision. And another kind of a thing which we also see during this time, that how the military forces, they were not at the disposal of League, as it did not have any kind of permanent military forces of its own. And we find that the great powers, they wanted to maintain the status quo, but others like Germany, Japan and Italy, they desired to grow big. So, they rejected the idea of a status quo. But it is doubtful if League could have employed an army against the powerful nations, even if it had one of its own. So it has also been seen in the hindsight that one of the reasons was the absence of a regular army which was at the disposal of the League of Nations. But even if it had an army which was at its own disposal, the experts, they have raised this issue that whether that army could have been used against the big powers. And we find that another important concern was the kind of embarrassment which was caused by the Conference of Ambassadors in Paris. It also in a way undermined the authority of the League of Nations, and it was intended to function only till League machinery was established, but it continued and on a number of occasions overruled the League of Nations as well. So we find that the coming of such kind of conferences of ambassadors in Paris was also some kind of a dampener for the League of Nations, because we find that this kind of a conference on certain occasions overruled the League as well. And we also see that in 1920 Lithuania was supported by League in her claim to Vilna, which they annexed from Poles, but later League allowed ambassadors to give Vilna to Poland. And similarly, in the Corfu incident, League was dominated by ambassador conference. And we also see that how during the world economic crisis in 1929, it also contributed to the decline of the League. And when we find that after the world economic crisis, inflation, unemployment and fall in the standard of living in most countries, they led to rise of the authoritarian governments in Britain, in Japan, Germany and Italy, and how they refused to follow the rules of the League and indulged in a number of actions which showed the weaknesses of the League. So we find that these kinds of authoritarian governments in Japan, Germany and Italy, in these three countries, they in a way were not ready to accept the diktats or the decisions of the League. And but when we tend to understand League and the kind of success and the failure with which League was associated, we find that it would be very unfair to see League as a complete failure. And many commissions and committees which were part of the League, they made a lot of contribution, and in terms of promoting the international cooperation, refugee organization under Fridtjof Nansen, it helped thousands of former prisoners of war left in Russia at the end of the war to return to their homeland, and for his crucial work he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1922. And how we see that this kind of a UNHCR, it established the Nansen Refugee Award in Nansen's honor following his death in 1930 at the age of 1969. Apart from this, we also see that how a League was also engaged in other works with regard to labor and to improve the condition of labor across the world. And the health organization, it also promoted the issue of hygiene and removal of epidemics as well. And how this particular body, it also survived the dissolution of the League, and how it was woven into the texture of the United Nations organization UNO. And UNO also had a body called the International Court of Justice, which was primarily based on the Permanent Court of International Justice of the League of Nations. So we find that some of the institutions of the League, how they were carried on by the UNO as well, and how League was also successful in some of the political disputes which had taken place at that point of time. And when you talk about some of the scholars like David Thompson, they have talked about the importance of such institutions in 1923. If they existed, then they did some kind of a commendable job, and they also exhibited a faith, a belief and an ideology on which so many governments of the world agreed or acted upon, the ideology of internationalism. And this ideology was based on the belief that most of the countries of the world, especially if their governments were based on some organized form of popular consent, were capable of cooperating successfully and voluntarily for the common objectives to which they had pledged themselves. So if the internationalism, it could succeed with positive will to cooperate, and as it will do some kind of an abundant goodwill and good faith. So, in this context we have to assess league, and we have to see the importance of the league, that how as an international body it played an important role, though it had its own share of success and failures, and how it was also could also be seen as a precursor to the United Nations organization. So, with this I would like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.